Welcome back to the program. I am super excited today to welcome my friend Anand Sekhar to the program. Anand is a 20-year veteran from Fidelity Investments. He's held leadership roles in marketing and product strategy. Most recently, he was a vice president of practice management and consulting, currently the head of segment marketing within Fidelity Charitable. Anand, welcome to the program. So great to have you here. What have I missed? You've done so much in your career. What have I missed? Fill in some gaps for me.
Yeah, no, first off, thank you, Dan, for the opportunity just to share perspectives on growth. I'm excited for this dialogue and conversation. I think the only thing perhaps to add and complement is, prior to coming to Fidelity 20 years ago, I'd spent some time also at Procter & Gamble. Maybe that'll come up in our conversation, both in marketing and operations. And, in the 14 years, I had the pleasure of leading and helping drive a lot of really fun growth in a practice management and business consulting role. I had the opportunity to sit with advisors and firm leaders for that 14 years and, would meet with hundreds of advisors. So that was a fun journey, but I'm also excited about the opportunity to also serve advisors in this new capacity with Fidelity Charitable now, which is an important aspect of the philanthropic journey a donor, an investor takes, is to work with their advisors. So that's all I would have perhaps to add to complement what you've already shared. Thanks, Dan.
Awesome. And again, thrilled to have you here, and especially given your background and your role in practice management and consulting. You've sat at the table with heads of growth, with heads of marketing, CEOs, heads of advisor services, and have consumed lots of information and insight on what's going well, what the challenges are, and things like that. So I think this is going to be an awesome conversation. Looking forward to jumping in. We call this podcast Grow Organically. So let's hit grow as the first topic. And maybe I'll ask if you could just level set where you think growth is today. We chatted a couple of days ago about what we're seeing in the market. Share us a little insight on your perspective. There are lots of different ways that people might measure growth, but I think you, given what you've done in your career, have a specific perspective.
Yeah, so let's talk about what is organic growth, because I think there may be some misses in perhaps thinking about what is organic growth. And when I think about organic growth, you have to take out first off any kind of inorganic growth, so M&A, of course, right? Especially right now with the largest firms in the wealth management space seeing a significant amount of that. The second component that's important to remove is market growth. I think about organic growth really as four components. How are you growing new assets or revenue from existing clients? New assets or revenue from new clients, net new clients, minus withdrawals from existing clients. So those clients that might be drawing down, perhaps they're in retirement, or withdrawals minus withdrawals from clients you lose. And that in our industry historically has been obviously 99% retention rate across the industry, but it is a contributing factor if you're not doing that well. So those four components, thinking about both the contribution side and the withdrawal side, the net of that is really what firms should be focused on first. It's important to note that if you think about the biggest firms, the largest firms in our industry, there's been a predominance of M&A as a driver of that growth. There's also, I think, systemically across the entire ecosystem of the wealth management firms, a over-reliance on market as being a dimension of growth overall. In a bull market, it's easy to see why that might be the case. I think in more turbulent waters, that's more also apparent when they are over-dependent on perhaps market growth. So I think firms should be really looking at really specifically on those four elements of organic growth, really focused on the contributions versus withdrawals.
Simple formula, and I've heard lots of different definitions in the market just on the addition side. Some people like to throw a little M&A in there just to round out some edges, I guess. But talk to us a little bit about, we talked about some percentages and what do you see as the real growth rates in the market? Firms that you've talked to, I think you've got an inside track, and maybe if you can bifurcate between what is good organic growth from a rate perspective, and from a rate perspective, what do you see some of the best firms delivering?
Yeah, so what I can say is that on average, organic growth across the wealth management space is somewhere between 2 and 4%. You look at all the studies that are out there in the industry, and it averages 2 to 4%. So, in a bull market, that number in total is probably around 10% because of the rising tides lift all boats. And if I take just the organic growth again and focus on then good firms, I'd say we see good firms between 7 and 10%. And the best firms, and this is rare, and the over $1 billion AUM firm, over 10%. Mm-hmm. Now, again, there are some that have multiple channels of growth, that can drive that. But I'd say that's what I see. So 7 to 10% being good. And I'd say over 10%, 10 to 20% for the extreme rarity, especially in the over $1 billion market. It's obviously easier to see that kind of growth in a smaller firm, to compound on a smaller base. It gets more challenging as the bigger you get.
Love it. Love it. I mean, just setting those baselines, I think, really important for this conversation, but really the conversation at large within the industry, to know where you stand, benchmark yourself against the good and the best. So as we think about growth, let's talk a little bit of headwinds and tailwinds. You've experienced a lot. You've had a lot of conversations. Let's first focus on the tailwinds. What do you see firms doing really well to drive organic growth within their firms?
When I think about growth, the first thing that I think about is a clear ideal client profile. I think a lot of times there's a few different ways to think about that. I think there's a given approach, which is affluence and age. I think many firms focus there, and they only focus there on affluence and or age, so age being a life stage. I think another way to think about it might be, some individuals might focus on a niche, an industry focus, and then specifically cater to the needs within that industry vertical. A great place to start is to find out, perhaps who are your existing client base that you're already serving today. And I think a lot of firms haven't spent enough time analyzing that. So beyond age and affluence, you can understand things like their profession. What are the things that are important to them? From where are they spending time in their community? What are their passions, their interests? I think that really understanding the needs of the client is incredibly important. So for instance, if you're focused on, let's say, tech executives, then that is your ideal client profile. After doing all the analysis you have based on the past success you've had with that market, I suspect you might be really good at RSU programs, understanding all the details and ins and outs, understanding how to engage with them proactively on that strategy because you understand, a specific company, perhaps a Fortune 500 company that's publicly traded, you understand the nuances of that company's RSU program. That's a level of detail that is unique, differentiated, hard to compete with, but also enables you to be on offense. So ideal client profile is the first thing. The second thing I think is incredibly critical for those firms that I see doing really well are multiple sources of revenue growth. And what I mean by that is I think about things such as the 401k. Are you doing 401k business that might complement your existing wealth management business? I think also financial planning fees, charitable planning. Obviously, clearly, given my new role, I see a lot of that where individuals will be doing broader aspects of revenue growth beyond just investment management, just traditional AUM based, perhaps revenue. I think the last thing is that how are you anticipating needs and exceeding expectations on your level of intimacy with your clients? 40 years ago, a financial advisor could be focused on just doing investment management. And if I think about that journey that an advisor's gone through over that 40 years, and there's many advisors that have been in the industry for that 40 years, it was about 20 years ago, we saw a shift with more advisors adopting a broader approach around financial planning. Mm-hmm. And then in the last 5 to 10 years, I see another pivot, which is those that are not just focused on the financial planning of a client, but now they're really thinking about these higher level needs for a given investor and family. And a good example of that is how are you engaging multi-generationally? Historically, when you think about financial planning and you think about engaging multi-generationally, I think a lot of firms might have focused on just tax preservation. How do I make sure I can get the next generation more money and avoid taxes? Perhaps that was one aspect of it. I think what is more powerful now is, are you having conversations multi-generation focusing on the values, not just the valuables? And I like to talk about that a lot because a good example of that is, philanthropic planning is a good example. We as a family have spent a lot of time thinking about a mission statement for our family around philanthropic planning and sharing that and curating that and co-creating that with our kids. That's not a conversation that I think enough advisors are having with their clients? How were they getting deeper and intimately more into their clients? And I think firms really be leaning into that and providing the resources and the capabilities for their advisors to do that is powerful, and training their advisors to do that. Implications if individuals are not doing this have been seen both in 2008 and 2022. In both of those years, with the markets going down, what we saw is asset managers were for sure really held accountable to the fact that they were talking about performance for so long. And what we saw is that broader wealth management firms in both of those time periods actually grew, especially the ones that were actually organically already had a really good organic engine and were positioning themselves really well. We actually saw that they gained share in those moments versus those that were losing. So I think there's a wonderful opportunity to rethink your value proposition overall, and how are you perhaps engaging your clients at this intimate level. That is, I think, a great opportunity for many firms to be embracing.
Yeah, I think that that last point on next gen, second generation of the family, third generation perhaps. Cerulli just came out with some updated data on the great wealth transfer, projecting I think it's 123 trillion. So the stakes are pretty high there. So completely agree that it's in an advisor and a firm's best interest to make sure that they're establishing those relationships, understanding what the primary client and then their children and their children's children, what they're thinking about. I think the notion of charitable is really strong there. I do want to go back to your point on ICP. As you think about a firm, 20 billion, 40 billion, and they're continuing to grow. I think sometimes people think about the ICP as a single client profile or persona. But firms can have multiple. They can focus on, maybe it's tech execs and there's a group within the firm that does that. But there can be multiple. And I think your point is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your point is know who you're trying to serve them really well, be really specific in the industry that they work in, they're employed in, understand the unique characteristics of their needs. But you can do that across multiple client profiles.
Yeah, 100%. And then I'll just add to that. So there's a firm that I can think of in Atlanta, relatively large RIA, that has multiple communities they've set up within that to not just think about specifically, they have executives. They've got individuals within the entrepreneur community. They've got individuals that are women. They have a community formed around women. They've got communities formed around, different consumer products verticals. They've got, because Atlanta has a lot of consumer products, professionals. So I think that it's really important to think through how is a firm specifically thinking through what are the ones that are relevant based off of looking at your past success? Because I think that, it's hard to pave a new path, but you probably, if you're a 10 to $20 billion firm, you're sitting on a treasure trove of existing data that you can be analyzing today to understand where do I already have an understanding of where I've already successful, and then leaning into that to create spaces. And I think creating community is something that's desirable. Like, entrepreneurs want to meet with other entrepreneurs to understand how they can continue to grow. Executives often feel lonely sometimes at the top. How can you bring community together across those? So I think there's a wonderful opportunity to also, as you think about identifying those ideal client profiles, and you're right, it's not just one, especially for those larger firms, it's going to be multiple. And it's thinking through then what's your engagement strategy with that specific population.
I love how you bridged client persona to community, because your clients it is a community, and there should be a sense of community, and to bring them together like that is certainly a value add. Love that. So let's transition a little bit. So we talked about the tailwinds. Let's talk a little bit about the headwinds. There's a lot of things that firms should be doing, and a lot of things that firms should perhaps stop doing. Talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you may have seen that firms might want to reconsider in their approach to organic growth.
Yeah, there's a few things that I think about. So first off, I think about a quick history lesson in our industry. So if you think about where an advisor started, many of them started out at many of the big wirehouse firms, right? And there's fewer than there were perhaps 40 years ago, as I mentioned earlier. And I think when they first started their journey, they may have started out cold calling. And they got to a place where they generated significant and perhaps sufficient revenue to live a certain lifestyle. They got comfortable. This would often reduce down, perhaps their motivation to cold call and pursue net new business. I think the other important data point that's extremely relevant. You look at many industry studies, regardless of which one, are in organic growth, and you'll find that about 50% comes from existing client referrals. So what's interesting about it is yes, cold calling had a place, and on average, it's about 20 to 25% of true pure business development. But at 50% is actually driving intimacy with your existing clients from an existing client referral perspective. So it's big. The big question is that I think the opportunity for firms is to leverage a process to support the growth. A good example of that is do you have a centralized lead generation process? That in essence focuses on both a marketing component and a centralized business development team that could do that. Are you leveraging optimizing search engine optimization? Are you perhaps using data to know your prospects better to be able to engage them more thoughtfully? Are you publishing content? All of that is typically a centralized marketing and business development activity effort, not just put on the advisor. I think that is a big part of it, and that is predicated on a big process. The second headwind I'll say is over-reliance on one referral source. I've seen some firms that have 70% of their new clients come from one referral source. That could be an accountant, as an example. And that over-reliance can be incredibly risky. A good example was when DOL first came out, way back when, accountants were worried about, am I now a fiduciary? And so they were worried about, am I now going to be considered a fiduciary if I'm getting solicitation fees and or other things, compensation and or playing the role I am? And so that put the advisor and the accountant in a tough spot from receiving those referrals. So there are things that we can't control that are really challenging to navigate. So what are those things you can control, which is not being over-reliant on one referral source? It is for sure better to have multiple sources that are then balanced from a referral perspective. And then lastly, a headwind to organic growth is for sure your current demographics. I talked about those 4 components of organic growth. One of those is existing client withdrawals. If you have an older client base, inevitably they're going to have either withdrawals, either themselves for paying down and, using for their own purposes, whether it's travel or housing or other expenses they want to live, and enjoy their retirement. But they could also be transitioning assets already to the next generation in a lot of different ways that are tax efficient. They may be also being generous and giving while in retirement. And so all those things really create headwinds. And we find that firms that have a much younger population have a tailwind that's incredibly rich and robust. A firm that has an average age of 50 years old to 55 years old, working with younger tech executives, is going to see much faster organic growth than a firm that has an average age of 65 plus.
And that's due to the net new assets from an existing client, right? That's part of that equation you talked about.
That's right.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we often hear that some firms rely on their best advisors to be their rainmakers, and maybe they were, as you said, years ago when they were growing up in the business, and that may not be the best use of their time now. Calling on new prospects. Maybe those great advisors should be focusing on some of those referrals, but that reliance on that referral, which I tend to think of as a unpredictable source of new revenue, it can be a challenge. So building out these other channels through which firms can connect with future customers, new prospects, I think is a key area of activity, and so maybe we'll transition to that now. Again, given your depth of experience in the sector and having consulted with firms for many years, maybe you could share a little bit of what you've seen as some of the best performing activities for firms to engage clients, families, and prospects at the same time.
Yeah. So when we look at and ask advisors in my past life around what are the best ways to drive engagement, with either existing clients and or prospects, the number one thing has always been events, in-person events, except for 2 years, I think, and that was 2020 and 2021.
COVID.
And outside of COVID, for the most part, it's been in-person events. And then it pivoted to, of course, a lot of online activities, but it's also come back. In-person events has come back. Now, the key element of those in-person events is relevancy. I think back to even just myself having attended some of these events back when I was much younger in my career. It was the steak dinner, and it would get you 30 to 40 folks, and maybe 1 to 3 leads, I suspect, for some of those advisors that did that. And a lot of times, having sat in some of those, and some of them being in certain segments of our wealth management ecosystem, it felt like a product push or focus on, perhaps investment themes. What I would say is that if you are looking to stand out and engage more intimately with their clients, is to marry up your clients' needs with those events. So I'll give you an example. Suppose you want to hold an event targeting all your business owners, and you decide to then invite a CPA, maybe an attorney, and a philanthropic consultant to share strategies for succession planning for those business owners. And as part of this, you could see the accountant talking about tax strategies. You could talk to the attorney about here are the legal considerations, and the philanthropic consultant could talk about how could you perhaps drive more charitable giving and also potentially reduce down your taxes from a future sale perspective, whether that's internal or external. And I think that type of topic is relevant for a small business owner, because I suspect many small business owners may not have thought through their succession plan. And I think not enough advisors probably have asked. They've probably done retirement planning without asking them, what's your succession plan internally? That's a deeper level of intimacy kind of question that I think advisors have an opportunity to press into. I also think that advisors, when I think about some of the opportunity that they have in front of them, is understanding their families. If they're dealing with teenagers right now, especially those with teenagers in middle school and perhaps early high school, one of the biggest issues our country faces right now is mental health issues among those teenagers. And there's a couple of good books out there. I'm sure some of you have read them about the anxiety that is in this generation, unfortunately. And one of the things that is one of the best events I saw an advisor put on was having a local adolescent therapist come in and talk to the parents about ways to help your kids navigate social media, all the aspects of anxiety, where their identity is, and the challenges of their identity. And so I think there's a wonderful opportunity for advisors to lean in and know their clients really well, and then be able to host these events so much more impactfully. The last thing I'll share on this is, 30 years ago, roughly, or maybe not even that long ago, I was at Procter & Gamble, and A.G. Lafley was the CEO, exceptional CEO. And he talked about 2 moments of truth for any consumer. And he said the first moment of truth is when a consumer buys your product. Mm-hmm. The second moment of truth was when that consumer was delighted and decided a product again. So as an example, suppose you buy Tide, the laundry detergent, and it removes the stain, and you end up buying the Tide again because it removed the stain, right? That would be a really good example of how that plays out. In 2011, Google coined the phrase the 0 moment of truth, which is when somebody Googles you. And while Google has a massive search share, I do wonder about AI. Is that going to be the next 0 moment of truth? Is when you look up something on the internet, you go to the internet to find an answer, and you get an AI response. We're getting that already in multiple places. And so I think a big opportunity from an advisor and a firm perspective, as you think about this, in addition to events, is to think through how are you showing up right now on the web, especially both in Google search and search results, but then also how are you searching up perhaps, very rapidly, and artificial intelligence answers as well.
Yes, I'd simply add social to that. I think folks are looking across multiple channels, not only in their initial search, but perhaps when they engage with a brand, they're going to go out and look for, does anybody I know use this brand? What is their message to the market? Are there reviews and things like that? So great insight on that. There's a lot that firms can do, but I love the notion of events, and really the event should be contextual to the attendees, not contextual to what you like, perhaps. So great advice, and I love the notion of bringing business owners together, perhaps in a smaller community, to share those insights, because you, as the advisor, can help bridge those conversations, buying between the CPA, the charitable planner, and the financial planner, and perhaps legal as well. Bring that all together and be that source of insight for that group in that local community.
What I think is important about social is validation.
Hmm.
If you think about the buying process that any of us go through for anything, a big part of the buying process is how are we validating our idea about buying a product. And I think that's what you're getting at is right now people are searching for validation somewhere, and social is the logical place.
Yeah. What are other folks saying about your brand? Yeah. You mentioned at the tail end of that search through AI. And we're going to come back to AI. I want to put a pin in that for just a second because I think that's a topic in and of itself. But more broadly, want to get your perspective on tech itself. So we talked about data as a foundation for strategic growth. Let's talk about the execution. Categorically, where do you think firms should be investing and building to improve their growth tech stack?
Yeah, so it can seem overwhelming for many firms to think about. I like to boil it down. At the heart of it is talking about a concept called the 4 Cs, which I think starts first with the advisor notion around what are they doing with engaging the clients, and I think it builds from there. So the 4 Cs are first, how are you helping advisors collect information about their clients? So what are the ways to collect information about their clients? This is the first C. The second is how are you then capturing that information? So putting that into a CRM system would be the easiest example of that. The third C is how do you capitalize on that information? And then the fourth C is doing that with compassion. And so I'll just pull the thread on that completely, and how then technology, I think, is an enabler and or perhaps influencer of that information. So when you have conversation with your clients, are you asking them things, for instance, everything about their life, including perhaps do they have pets?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a blind spot for many advisors. They don't even know that the clients have a dog. They might know the kids. Do they know the client's dog's names? Do they know perhaps the dog's birthdays? And for some people, that's important because they don't have any kids or they're empty nesters, and their dog's now their kid. And so the opportunity is for them to be able to leverage that information to then capitalize by then perhaps having a dog event. You can't do that at all. You can't put on an event, and think about the automation that is necessary to be able to do that type of work. So there's a marketing automation part of it. Especially when you get to these bigger, larger firms, the $10 billion plus firms, is a big part of automation to be able to send out custom newsletters to people, perhaps the dog lovers, if you want to invite them. There's a marketing automation for the business owners that I described earlier. There's a marketing automation engine that drives that. And then you want to be able to understand and measure and report on what is working. Mm-hmm. When you send out a newsletter, what's working? What are does a newsletter with images work better than one without images? Is a newsletter that is has this type of content resonating? All of that is incredibly important that I think is for those that are in the marketing function, I think those have to really pay attention to understanding that level of detail. And I think a big part of that technology has always been centered around the advisor. And now it's by taking and focusing still on the advisor, but then making them more efficient and more effective at what they're doing.
Love that. The notion of the 4 Cs, I think about that as a marketer. Collect, capture, and how are you going to use this data? We talked in the events about making sure there's context. You're meeting your prospect or meeting your client, where they are and what they're interested in. Understanding who your prospect is, personal interest, hobbies, things like that. That's a way to make that personal connection. We know that this business is really one that's built on relationships and trust. And so how do you start to build that? So knowing the birth date of the puppy is a good one. I like that because it shows that you care. Yeah, you're that aware.
Oftentimes, Dan, I'll tell you that most don't know that, and so can't even send out a birthday card to the dog.
Yeah. I've heard some great stories from some of the online or digital based pet food companies and what they do and how they engage with their audience, and it's super, super personal. And you hear those stories repeated time and time again. So they're definitely onto something there. Let's shift gears. I want to hit the AI question because it's big. I don't think a day goes by that I don't get a handful of emails and see a couple headlines about AI. More broadly speaking, but certainly within our industry. And so the question for you is, what have you seen in the market that you think could be a game changer for firms, and perhaps why?
So let me level set with what we're seeing right now for the evolution of AI into the wealth management space and some of the elements of it. So I think the first is productivity, right? I think workflows, automation, allowing advisors to focus on the important things. One of the concepts that I like to talk a lot about is our advisors really working at the top of their license. I found, historically, advisors are spending too much time on things that perhaps are not driving the most amount of value to their clients. And that term, term from working at the top of the license actually came from the medical profession when I talked to my sister, because they were facing the same thing. Doctors were doing a lot of manual things, and they're trying to increase basically they working and focusing on the right interactions with their clients, patients. And they did that by surrounding themselves with nurse practitioners, nursing assistants, so on and so forth. And now technology. I think our same is true for our advisors. Are we enabling them to actually deliver financial planning advice, asking questions about what's really important to the clients versus spending time on doing routine tasks and their desktop? And I don't think enough advisors have been spending that time with their clients instead of in the back office. The second thing I'll say is marketing, content creation, even for advisors, blog posts, LinkedIn, social media posts, all of the opportunity to take something like we're doing today, a podcast, and then very quickly create a blog post or a content to post out there on social media. That is incredibly, efficient, has a high degree of efficacy. The watch out is you need to make it your own and make sure it's in your own tone and language. So I think that's just a caution. I've seen that, where somebody just puts it in and literally words are repeated, and there's risks with regards to it. I think we all know. And then the third area, I think this is where I think it's going to be longer term, game changer, perhaps a question about whether or not we're going to be able to get there. But how can we use this with client facing engagements? And that's going to be, there's some big things, whether it's summarizing meetings, so if we're on Zoom with a client, to use some of the functionality, because there's also the privacy considerations and other things that have to be worked through with all the confidentiality, and it's important. And also making sure that we have permission from the client to be able to do that type of work. But that's going to be, I think, the next sort of frontier is how do we think about it from a client face? And that can even include things such as financial planning. How is AI going to be an enabler to actually drive financial planning? I think a big part of this is we see that to some degree in some of the tax software that exists today. How do we then see it in perhaps financial planning, for individuals as well?
Great perspectives. And I guess the one thing I would add to that is just test it. There are lots of great tools out there, and try them out. You don't have to commit. You don't have to, perhaps put something on when you have a client call going on. But maybe you just do a test with a colleague and see what the output is, and start to try it and see how it'll work for you, and see how you can bring it into your practice. And I think that first point you made about workflows really critical, because I think there is some laborsome, time suck type tasks that firms need to do, advisors need to do, and leveraging AI can make that stuff go a lot faster. So last question, and this is going to be a little tricky for you, but I ask this of all my guests, and most of them are heads of growth or CMOs or advisors themselves. So I'm gonna change your background, and I'm gonna make you the head of growth at a firm. Let's say it's a $20 billion firm. And so given what you know now, what would you have started to do or perhaps stop doing 5 years ago?
Yeah. So I think let me start with first the start, which is I would have invested faster and more earnestly in my marketing tech stack. And I think back, there's some that did that early. I think 5 years ago would have been early. On a relative basis perspective, I think we saw the acceleration. And obviously, if I think about where we would have been exactly 5 years ago, we would have been 1 month into COVID, right? And so you think about that contextually, or 2 months into COVID, whatever that is. But we contextually, the importance of it, had we started that 5, maybe even 6 years ago, would have been transformational. I think at that moment, and I think stopped expecting accidental growth. And I think that unfortunately, as perhaps that, head of growth at a firm, it has to be intentional. And I think that not enough time historically has been spent on intentional growth, process driven intentional growth versus accidental, perhaps tripping over kind of growth. And so I think, and if I think about what would you do differently as a result of that, is driving more process and really focus on business development as a discipline, setting goals for the entire organization around that process. And I don't think enough organizations, I know some of the most mature ones obviously clearly do, especially those that are now backed by private equity, have to. But I think that more of that discipline earlier on, I think, is incredibly important.
Yeah. So start focus on technology and stop expecting new clients to walk in the door.
Yeah.
Love it. Anand, thank you so much for joining us today. Always deeply appreciate conversations with you. I always learn so much, given everything that you know about the space and your experience. It's invaluable. So thanks again for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for the opportunity, Dan.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Organically podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Visit catchlight.ai, where you can access all our podcasts, including show notes and other resources to keep learning. This podcast was produced by Catchlight Insights, LLC. It is for informational and educational purposes only. The content of this podcast does not constitute an offer or recommendation of any securities and is not intended to provide tax, legal, or investment advice. The views expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily those of Catchlight or its affiliates, and are as of the date indicated, based on the information available at that time, and may change based on market or other conditions. Catchlight does not assume any duty to update any of the information. Catchlight Insights, LLC is an affiliate of Fidelity Investments. However, Catchlight and other third parties mentioned in the podcast are independent entities and not affiliated. Catchlight does not endorse any investment advisor or provide advice or recommendations to any prospective or existing client of an investment advisor as to the selection or retention of that investment advisor. This information is not intended for any person or entity in any jurisdiction where the distribution or use of such information would be contrary to local law. Third-party trademarks referenced herein are the property of their respective owners. All others are the property of Catchlight Insights, LLC. Copyright 2025, Catchlight Insights, LLC. All rights reserved.